Well, hello there. My name's Adam Swayne. I'm Deputy Head of Keyboard Studies at the Royal Northern College of Music. Joining me today are five wonderful composers, as well as my friend, the pianist Rachel Fryer. Rachel, if you could give us a wave. Excellent. Rachel is visiting lecturer at the East Sussex Academy of Music, as well as concert director at Music and Wine at St Luke's in Brighton. Now, Rachel has performed Bach's landmark work, the Goldberg Variations, several times. I've heard a couple of those performances. And from that point, she's commissioned our composers, who I'll introduce in a moment, to contribute to a new project called Variations Down the Line. Five new pieces embedded between Bach's Variations will be premiered online as part of the forthcoming Jam on the Marsh Festival. The broadcasts are on Sunday the 9th of August, that's part one, and Wednesday the 12th of August, that's part two. Both performances begin at 7:30, and links may be found in the description alongside this video. So, Rachel, I believe the idea for this project came to you during your work with young musicians in East Sussex.
Yes, that's right, yeah. So I teach at East Sussex Academy of Music in Lewes, where I work with 16 to 19-year-old students. And my boss there invited me to give a workshop on the Goldberg Variations. So I went through the variations, gave some demonstrations, and then the students got into small groups and created their own performances, sort of improvisations and compositions using the chords and bass line as a starting point. And it just seemed to go really well. And I thought, oh, it's really nice to hear the Bach. And it feels like Bach because of the chords and bass line, but it's really nice to hear it in a 21st century style. So that was really how the idea began. I kind of sat on the idea for a little while and chatted it through with a few people, and everyone seemed to think it was a good idea. So that was how it all started.
Fantastic. And from that point, you've approached our five composers. I'll introduce them now. So first of all, we have Samuel Becker. And alongside composing, Sam works as a conductor, performer, and educator for Lewisham Music. Alongside original compositions for orchestra and wind band, he's also completed orchestrations for several unfinished works by Prokofiev. Yeah. So, Sam, thinking about Prokofiev and for this project, Bach, do you often refer to music from the past for inspiration?
Not particularly necessarily, no. The Prokofiev completions were a very particular kind of work, working from his sketches, where this project was something quite different. I don't normally go back, but I found this project very interesting to do.
Fantastic, thank you. And then we have Nicola Lefanu. Nicola's extensive catalogue includes several major works for the stage, as well as recent commissions from the Royal Philharmonic Society, amongst others. In 2017, she was a composer on the week on Radio 3. Nicola, you've written of your lifelong familiarity with the Goldberg Variations. Can you tell us a little more about that?
I suppose it's always been a work that I've loved, although I certainly don't have the keyboard technique to play very much of it. It's such a virtuoso work. But it's also, as with a lot of Bach keyboard music, there's a kind of hidden composition lesson inside the piece when one's playing it. So yes, it's something I've lived with.
Fantastic, thank you. Alison Kay. Alison's compositions have been performed by the BBC Singers, Philharmonic Orchestra, and at the Huddersfield, Spitalfields and Brighton festivals. She lectures in composition at the Royal College of Music. Alison, it's great to see you. I was really sorry to hear you were unwell at the beginning of lockdown. Can you tell us what effect this had on your music?
Well, initially, I suppose the guidelines, the brief for the project had been quite restrictive, and I was trying to find my way through that. But then I don't know if it was COVID, but I was certainly very ill and felt a lot of pressure on my chest, and everything felt very constrained, and that sort of fed through into the work. Certainly the canon, less so the other pieces, but but yes, it certainly it had a very particular effect on writing. Yeah.
Okay, it's going to be fascinating to get involved with the sort of nuts and bolts of what you guys did responding to the projects, and linking in with the circumstances that we've all been dealing with is fascinating. Thank you, Alison. So, Michael Finnessy. Michael's works are performed and celebrated internationally. He's equally adept at writing for and working with community ensembles, as he is designing wonderfully complex and often virtuosic scores. Radio 3's Here and Now showcased his music in 2016. Michael, you've mentioned that the project would increase your knowledge of Bach's technical processes. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Well, as Nicola said, I'm interested in the fact that a lot of Bach's music appears to me to be didactic, partly in intention. So what he wants to do is not only entertain you, which he can do very adeptly, but he also wants to teach you about composing, teach you about how he's working. And I find this very interesting as another composer, 2.5 centuries, 3 centuries after, to see how he goes about working with his material. And what I wanted to do is to take the material, not the style, not the ground bass, nothing really to do with his source material, but I was going to treat Bach as the source material and work with that.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Great. Well, lastly, we have Julian Broughton. Julian's compositions include a recent symphony for the Horsham Symphony Orchestra, alongside a clutch of chamber music, as well as pieces for solo piano, which showcase his own superb skills at the instrument. Julian, I'm wondering if you find it easier or more difficult writing for an instrument you know so well.
That's a very interesting question. I think the answer is probably both. It's easier in the sense that I know what can be done and can easily enough do it myself. So the sounds that you get coming back to you are the right ones. You know what you're doing. And of course, a deep knowledge of the piano from many years of playing it and writing for it means that you can have a sense of drawing on all its wonderful resources as you need to. And that's exciting. And I suppose that the risk always, if you are a pianist yourself, is that some things fall too easily under the fingers and the tail starts to wag the dog and you're no longer in charge of the creative side of it. So it's trying to get a balance between those two things, I think, that is tricky if you're a pianist yourself.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Well, that's a window into our 5 composers and how they've approached the project, but we still haven't found out quite what Rachel asked them to do. So, Rachel, I wonder if you can let us know what was the brief you offered our composers.
Yeah. So originally the idea was to explore the brief that I'd given the students I was working with, so that the variations would be based on the chords and/or bass line. But as I worked with the composers and discussed it with them, I realised that wouldn't necessarily work for all of them. So what we have kept kind of preserved from the Bach is the variations fall into a structure of 3. So the first in each set is free form, and the second in each set is a toccata, and the third is a canon. So all of them have followed this 3-part variation structure. And other than that, I think everyone's explored really different aspects, and it's been a real joy that they're so diverse. It kind of seems really appropriate that the Goldberg variations, which in themselves are really diverse, have been made even more diverse by these editions. But originally, I had conceived it to be kind of a standalone work with 15 variations, and it was only when I was chatting to Jam Festival they said, oh, well, why don't you intersperse it in the Bach? It would be so much better. And I have to admit, at first I was pretty resistant. And then I started to be won round, and I think it works really well. I hope, and when you listen to them, you'll see that, you know, hearing the Bach and the contemporary juxtaposed is just really refreshing for both of them, really.
Okay, that's great. I know that some of our composers have responded specifically to individual variations by Bach. Michael, for example, I believe you drew upon variation 19 and 21 as a starting point.
At some point in the negotiations, I think I wanted to know who'd been assigned what, so that I didn't cross over with anybody, because I wanted to use, as I said, I wanted to use him as material, his music as material. So, in fact, I don't think, apart from the toccata, where I did use my own material derived from the outer movements, the canon and the genre piece at the beginning, use exactly the same notes as Bach did, but as Eric Morecambe famously put it about the Grieg Piano Concerto, not necessarily in that order.
Splendid, fantastic. Nicola, do you have a specific starting point? I believe you've drawn upon the canon at the seventh idea, which comes, of course, quite late in the set.
Well, I simply wrote that first because I love writing canons. And so when I got Rachel's invitation, I kind of didn't stop to think. I wrote a canon, and then I realized actually it was, unwittingly, I'd written it for harpsichord. So then I went back and revised it to be pianistic. And it kept to the binary structure, but it was not in G major in any way. It wasn't a tonal piece, although it kind of respects Bach's G major, and it also respects the idea of a movement away and a movement back. I think what I liked was the fact that I always had the aria in the back of my mind, but it was never in the forefront of my composition. So that in the first piece, for example, the pitches of the bass line of Bach's aria are silently held in the bass by the pianist's left hand. And then the right hand plays material, which is, my material. But what it does is trigger the harmonics of that ghost in the bass, which means, I hope, a kind of ghost of Bach's tonality. It was fun to do.
Fabulous. And this idea of ghost trickles into Alison's variations, one of which I know is called the Ghost Canon. Was that your starting point, similar to Nicola's, Alison?
Yes, I mean, and also similar to Michael's in a way, because I decided to use all of Bach's notes all in the right order for the toccata, but in the wrong place. So it was just registrar. But the Ghost Canon does a similar thing. It takes Bach's initial notes for each portion of the canon, but then constrains all my material intervanically within that. So yes.
Thank you very much. And canons, again, feature in Julian's piece. I think you used the canon at the fourth. Was that your main starting point, Julian?
No, it wasn't. I wrote the canon last. And I started with the toccata, partly because at that stage I hadn't quite read Rachel's small print carefully enough, and was not really aware that I was supposed to be sticking to the 32 bars and to the ground harmony, yes, certainly, but other than that, I felt a certain freedom. And with a toccata, there is a kind of wish to let the music go where it wants to go. And so I broke with the 32 bar structure there, but then did read Rachel's original message properly and thought I'd better go back to doing something a little bit more strict for number one, which I wrote next, the Saraband, and then I wrote the canon last.
Fabulous. We'll talk a little bit about this idea of sort of freedom and restraint when, or constraint, should I say, when you're writing variations on a specific theme. But Sam, I just wondered, Nicola mentioned that she originally wrote her piece for harpsichord. I know that in your piece you've used a lot of pianistic ideas, for example, holding bass notes down and resonance appearing in the upper register. Was the idea of pianistic effects your starting point, or did you have a different one?
Not particularly. I'm not a particularly good pianist myself, so completely the opposite of what Julian was saying about the tail wagging the dog. I unlike the others, actually kept to the chord structure very strictly and the 32 bar, I decided that I was going to constrain myself within the parameters that Bach set out with. So the chord structure, and for most of the pieces, the bass line as well. So that means my piece other slightly more interesting ways to do things in that structure.
Thank you very much. It might have just been me, but I lost Sam for a little bit there. So I'll ask you to keep speaking if that's all right.
Yes.
This idea of freedom and constraint. I mean, Bach has written a theme. He writes 30 variations on it, and then composers come along and contribute even more variations. And it's already quite a tall order in many ways. How did you find dealing with that issue?
Because I kept to it very strictly, I found the parameters were very clearly laid out. So I had the chords, and that's what I decided I was going to work with. But I'm sure everyone would agree with composers is that we make those decisions early on anyway. That freedom and constraint aren't two opposites. You get freedom from the constraints you put on or that are placed on you. Yeah, I found it okay. The canon I found very tricky I did a canon at the second, and to do that strictly within the chord structure, I found really hard. And my admiration for Bach I mean, it's high anyway, but I was a bit dazzled, slogging away at and realizing how he just churned them out.
I mean, Rachel mentioned the importance of numbers in the Goldberg variations, and we tend to think perhaps unfairly of Bach as a process composer, but this is, as I say, perhaps not the case. And I know Michael has written that Bach is more of an aleatoric composer. So I'm guessing you didn't feel particularly constrained when you wrote your variations, Michael?
No, but I wasn't. I wasn't trying to replicate anything about the ground bass or the harmonic structures. I was, as it were, writing through the Goldbergs in my own way, finding my own way around a city, if you like. If you think of the set of 3 variations as a place you're visiting, I didn't have a map, so I made my own map as I was going along, and that was very fascinating. I didn't want to be constrained by the ideas of tonality, because in the period since Bach died, a lot of very major composers have written works in imitation of Bach. Schumann, Mendelssohn, Saint-Saëns, you know, all of this stuff with reasonably good fugues, sometimes good canons, and all the sort of passage work. I didn't want to make derivatives of that again, so I wanted to derive material more directly, if you like, from what was there on the printed page of Bach's work.
Thank you very much. Julian, freedom, constraints, how was it for you?
Well, my starting point when I first began to think about it was the toccata, as I said. And for the toccata, I felt that the main thing was to try and make the music move between the same main landmarks as Bach, but not to worry too much about the journey between each of those landmarks. So the modulations that I use get to the same place as Bach, but not in quite the same way. And they don't, as I said before, they don't occupy the same amount of space exactly. But with the first variation, which is a saraband, what I wanted to do was pick up from the actual theme, because Bach in a way doesn't do that very much. He's more interested, I think, in the ground bass and the harmony. But it's actually a very beautiful melody, the aria, and very ornamental, which is a bit surprising for a set of variations. You usually expect the theme to be a bit stolid almost, so that there's something to vary. But in Bach's case, it's already a very beautiful, very finished, polished piece of work. And I wanted to work with what I found particularly delightful among some aspects of its melody, and let the harmony adjust itself according to that. So well, I think that sort of answers your question, because you can see that I was working within certain constraints, but also allowing myself a freedom from some of the things that I might have felt obliged to follow, including the pattern of the harmony.
Thank you. Nicola, I know that your prelude is very grounded in G major, and I think you mentioned this before. Was that a conscious decision at the beginning of your compositional process?
Well, none of the pieces are tonal, as I understand it. And I think, I mean, constraints certainly create the opportunity of freedom for me. I mean, there's always that balance between, and freedom with no constraint is not freedom. So when Rachel originally mentioned the chord structure, I said I wouldn't be able to do it. I think the main constraint for me was the symmetry, because usually my music is not so symmetrical. I'm more interested in asymmetry. So using 16 bars with repeat and 16 bars with repeat was quite a considerable constraint. And then my pieces are not tonal, but they arrive at, I suppose, a kind of harmonic series of G at the final cadence each time, a G resonance. So that was how, well, for one thing, I assumed that since Bach in G major would be either side of my variations, I wanted my variations to lead back to Bach without a kind of awkward jump.
Excellent. Alison, I want to come to you at this point, because one of the most glorious markings I've seen in a new piece for a while is that the tempo of one of your variations can be anywhere between 160 and 420 beats per minute. And I think it just gives the performer such a fantastic sense of freedom. But did you feel a similar sense of freedom as you were composing?
In a way. At first, I felt very constrained, and then I found my freedoms within it. And I think also allowing some of the variations to have different possibilities for performance was quite interesting. So the canon, for instance, can be either very, very fast or very, very slow. And I think it works in both ways, but not necessarily in the middle, because it sounds too much like Bartok or Bach. But it's finding the freedom within the brief, I think, and finding a way to work around that, but also to keep your own identity within that framework. And because I quite often work with register and things like that, and sort of reimagining the harmonies in very different ways by remolding them in time and space. But I realised I didn't stick to the 32 bars. Sorry, Rachel.
Rachel, I bring you in, the perfect place to bring you in. I'd really like to know your experience of learning the pieces in response to what the composers have said.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said, every set is very different. So yeah, I guess I approached each set in a very different way. I mean, it's very interesting. If you look at Bach, I feel like the way Bach writes for pretty much any instrument is sort of the opposite to what Julian was saying, as in he writes the music on the page and he doesn't really take into consideration what it's like to play it. So it's kind of up to us to make it work or not. And that's perhaps especially relevant in the toccatas. I was quite grateful that none of the composers wrote for a 2-manual harpsichord. Because in the Bach, of course, as it was written for 2 keyboards, the toccatas are particularly challenging. But yeah, going back to the freedom thing in the Bach as well, Bach writes almost no tempo markings in all of the variations, and obviously no dynamics because it would have been played on harpsichord at the time. So I think that's quite an interesting thing about the piece, is that really everyone interprets it very differently, and it's even played on different instruments as well. And it seems entirely appropriate. So I'm sure he would have thoroughly approved of additions to the set. Yeah.
Excellent. Michael, I know that your variations, dynamics and tempo, you've made a decision not to include those. Is that a homage to Bach, if you like, or is that your own decision?
Laziness. I I like working with performers. So I think that the performer can contribute an idea of tempo, their particular reading of of what's there. I don't have a dogmatic idea of what's going to come out. I mean, I still work with pitches. There's nothing random in that sense about the piece. I still work with rhythms, but the tempo, well, as Alison was saying, it can work anywhere. I mean, if up to a point, I suppose, if it gets ridiculously fast or ridiculously slow. But I'd like to give the margins to the possibility for the performer to do something with it. I mean, that's my idea of every musical score I write, not just these. I might say though that I was so interested in the project, I'm actually going to increase my set of 3 to a set of 9, because I didn't really feel I'd explored my city quite well enough.
Well, that's really exciting news. That's fantastic. And I mean, I guess because I'm familiar with many of your Coma scores, and so I know that the concept of a chorale is important to you. I'm thinking of the first piece you ever wrote for Coma had that idea of everyone participating on an equal level in the same way that Bach designs his chorales. So has Bach always been important to you as a composer, or am I overstating it?
Yes, of course. I mean, but it's quite hard to walk round Bach, isn't it? You can't kind of ignore the fact that he's there. And I think probably everybody you're talking to this morning takes different things from the idea, the cultural idea as well, of what Bach is. But for me, music doesn't exist without performance. So at some point, you as a composer have to deal with the communication with the performer. And we use notation for that, and we have to learn to use that expressively and indeed, in a sense, to psychologically manipulate the performer in the gentlest and nicest possible way.
Fantastic. Nicola, I was fascinated by Michael's words there, the cultural, was it cultural significance of Bach? What's your cultural significance?
Oh, goodness. Can I just comment on something else first, which is the question of dynamics and tempo? Because I think that the music has to embody dynamics and tempo so that it shouldn't be necessary to put them. And sometimes with regret, I do end up putting, for example, a metronome mark. I'd be more likely to put a character direction, I think. And again, originally my sketches didn't have dynamics. And then I ended up, but they're scarce, it's forte and piano. You know, I didn't feel the need for the kind of detailed sort of pointillistic dynamics that a score might have. But as for the cultural phenomenon, I don't know, I'm a practitioner, as everyone is here probably, rather than a sort of theorist, so that I'm not very good when I'm talking on cultural theory. I've always known and loved Bach from when I first played tiny keyboard pieces, I suppose. And the first music I can remember listening to almost, apart from say hearing my mother Elizabeth McConkey's music being rehearsed, and that business that Michael's saying about performers was crucial because we lived in the country and a performer would come down to play to her. But we also had a thing called a radiogram, which in the early 1950s was a sort of amazing thing to have in the house. And there were 78 records of the Bach double violin concerto. And I love that music. And I sort of imagined people in what I call London suits playing it inside the radiogram. Anyway, so that's where I began, double concerto.
Wow, fantastic. Sam, you're a practitioner, to use Nicola's words. You're an educator as well as a composer. Bach's music, is it for you as useful a tool in pedagogical terms as it is compositional inspiration? Where are you coming from on this?
I think traditionally it has been. I think from a cultural point of view, Bach probably for all of us is a touchstone about what it is to be a craftsman, to be a committed and engaged with the day-to-day writing music, getting it performed. He's almost like the highest example of that. I, like Nicola, I had an old record of the double violin concerto as well, which I fell in love with when I was young. But what's interesting, of course, is I think our first experiences of Bach would have been on some early recordings, those kind of heavy, before the early music movement kind of really kicked off. And I don't know whether there's a more immediate, a sort of slightly more immature, younger reaction to it, you know, when you first hear it as a child, maybe. Obviously, the experience of playing it at the piano is different again. Whether attitudes to Bach have changed slightly because of our different views of great men in history, and also because of the early music movement and how music's thought of slightly differently, or we hear it slightly differently. That can bring new things, certainly, yeah.
Great. Well, speaking as the most immature person here in every sense, I can tell you my first experience of Bach, and this is far from immature, but my first experience was through Jacques Lussier and his improvisations based on Bach, which I still adore. Julian, I mean, that's another fantastic pianist. Jacques Lussier, Bach, what's your cultural go-to?
I haven't listened to Jacques Lussier for a long time, but I really enjoyed it. And I think actually Lussier's way of dealing with Bach says something important about Bach, which is to do with what Michael was referring to, that didactic quality, and the sense you have with Bach that there's something exemplary about his music, something exemplary about the way the notes are put together. This is how you do it. This is what works. And if it works in one way, then it'll work in lots of other ways. So you can do it as a jazz trio, or you can do it with early music solemnity, or you can do it whatever way you like. And I suppose for me, I mean, I love Bach, but I like certain pieces of Bach much more than others. And there are times where, for my personal taste, I feel he's being too exemplary and not having enough fun. Unlike Handel, who always had fun, but wasn't always exemplary enough. So I like, I mean, for example, playing the French suites, I love number 5 because it's so tuneful. And the other ones I like and I admire, but I don't thoroughly love them in quite the same way. And so my attitude towards Bach is slightly that of a naughty schoolboy, I think. And faced with the headmaster, you do want to play a trick on him sometimes. And I did feel I was trying to do that in the canon, in the last of my 3, because I wrote it in strict canon up to a certain point, and then thought, well, I could go on like this, but I don't know whether I really want to. I want to do something slightly different at this point and a bit looser and freer. So I did. And I felt that was, I mean, I wasn't thumbing my nose at Bach, far from it, but I was allowing myself to do something that was a little bit naughty, a little bit different from that rather stern exemplariness that he tends to provoke.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I've often wondered whether, because I totally get where you're coming from here, but I often wonder whether the fact that we're fed Bach, as I was saying to Sam, on a pedagogical level, at every stage of our sort of school and college careers, chorales at GCSE, first year keyboard studies, students at RNCM have to play a prelude and fugue from Well-Tempered Clavier. It's on the syllabus, and as with all rules, the temptation is then to mess around, and I would encourage that in every sense, really. The most obvious sense being, of course, finding the expressive paths in the music. Addison, you work at the Royal College. Compositional curriculum, I guess Bach features much more on the sort of academic side of things, but for you, what are we talking in terms of cultural significance?
Well, I think my foundations for craftsmanship are really centered on Bach, you know, from learning how to write chorales and voice leading, but finding ways in voice leading within my own harmonic language. I think you learn an awful lot by osmosis from having gone through that training. And you know, early childhood memories, you know, playing Bach, but also a phenomenal performance of the St. Matthew Passion in the Liverpool Cathedral, And really, I've not considered this for some time, but I think it is pretty central to my learning. So yeah, it's very important, and I think students gain a lot from it by learning just the craftsmanship, And how do you learn about a composer? Well, if you try and write like a composer, you get a lot more knowledge than reading a book, I feel. So yes, I think it is central.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, central for us as pianists, I'm sure Rachel would agree, is the idea of counterpoint and playing many parts at once. Rachel, do you want to say something about dispatching counterpoints?
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize really, because I think it's such an important part about Bach, and it's an important part about the Goldberg variations. It's all of those, his craft of writing with all the parts interweaving equally important is even though obviously that's really important in the canons, it comes up in so many of the other variations that are very contrapuntal. And that was, one of my criteria when I chose the composers. I knew that all the composers had experience, especially of counterpoint. And I really enjoy, I suppose that's something, again, I grew up on as well, playing the preludes and fugues. And probably any pianist would have been taught to sing or bring out all the individual parts in turn. And that was, I really enjoyed the discipline of that way of learning contrapuntal pieces. And then I've really enjoyed doing that with the Goldberg variations, especially it's an opportunity when you have the repeats that you can bring out different things on the repeat in different parts. And it's also a challenge because you've got all these choices. Well, which part do I bring out? And you can't just bring out one part, you have to switch between them. And it's just a really important, and that's one thing I think which has been a constant with learning everybody's canons, especially, and learning the Bach. But then it's also really interesting what Julian was saying, is that I think we tend to think of Bach as quite a serious, scholarly composer. And I wonder if that's because of his contrapuntal writing. But then when you look at his dances, like the suites and some of these movements as well, they're just so fun and playful. And yeah, maybe that side of Bach can get overlooked if we're not careful. So I don't know what other composers think of that.
Fascinating. Who wants to come in?
Yes, well, I think that the well-tempered clavier, it's a wonderful musical pun, isn't it? I think Bach had a great sense of humour. And playing Bach is like having a conversation with someone. That is what's so wonderful, that he's speaking to one. And as for counterpoint, I think my music has become more contrapuntal as I've got older. I think when I was young, I had an idea that I wasn't any good at counterpoint. I don't know if it was true or not, but anyway, that's what I thought. And anyway, more positively, I think I was obsessed with discovering what kind of harmony I wanted to create. No, I think that's enough from me on that one.
Sam, can I bring you in here on repeats? Rachel mentioned the concept of having repeats and doing something a bit different. I know you put repeats in your variations.
Yeah. So I decided I was keeping with the structure, so I put repeats in. I think most of them have first and second time bars, just to transition in different ways. That was quite a challenge, to have material that was strong enough that could stand up to be repeated, that maybe had something worth listening to on a second go through. So that there was just that raised the bar a little bit, and perhaps I don't know how the others feel, but I probably led to me making certain decisions rather than others.
Julian, are you a repeats person or no repeats person?
On this occasion, I'm just trying to remember, actually. I need to look at the music. No, I don't think I put any repeats in. I think my feeling was that the Goldberg variations is a huge work. And one thing I didn't want to do was outstay my welcome. So if you put in repeats, then there is the risk that you simply go on too long, of course. But the other thing was that Rachel's idea for performing this still gives, of course, in a way, pride of place to Bach, because there are more of the Bach variations, than by any other composer. So it's quite important that whatever you insert somehow works as part of that overall picture. So for that reason, I didn't want to go on too long. And I also wanted to build a lot of variety within each section, each phrase of each variation, partly because you can. If you're writing for piano, you've got the possibility of dynamics, of harmonics, of pedaling, all of that. So in a sense, the variety can be built in.
Brilliant. Alison.
Hi. I just wanted to come in there just because Rachel asked me quite late in the process if repeats should be included, and I suddenly thought, oh no, I should have written more. I would have to rewrite them if they're going to be repeated. I would have to rewrite, and I'm not averse to doing that, but it was a bit late in the day to start doing that. But it was interesting, and it was something that I probably should have thought about earlier. But I may still write new versions for repeats.
Fabulous. I can't wait to hear all these pieces. I've seen a flash of the scores in Rachel's garden, but there's nothing oral yet, and I can't wait to find out. But Michael, having seen your beautiful handwritten scores, I'm kind of imagining in my head that there aren't repeats there, but I could be wrong.
I don't put repeat marks in the notationally, but I do repeat the material, but with slight changes, so that it sounds like a repetition, but in actual fact, certain things have changed, notes have shifted position, and so on, because that's more fun to do it that way. I think I've only ever done a major structural repeat once, and that was in a homage to Greed, and I wanted to see if it worked, and it was quite interesting, but I don't think I would do it normally, not a literal repeat. And I remember Bernard Stevens, my teacher at the RCM, telling me that if I wrote the repeat out literally, I'd find something more interesting to do the second time, and indeed that is usually the case. So no, I don't do bar line repeats.
Okay, well, Rachel, I want to bring you back in at this point because this idea of changing the material each time, I just wonder if, having seen all these variations, has it changed your approach to playing the Bach?
If I'm honest, I don't think it has. Yeah, I mean, I think as a performer, when I do the repeats, I think it is really important if you're going to do the repeat to find a way to say it differently. And it can be a really obvious thing like a change in dynamic, but it could be more subtle than that. It could be just a feeling, a slight approach. But I don't know, I've been playing the Bach for so many years that I think it's very embedded in how I play it. But actually, I tell you what is very different is playing the new music in and amongst the Bach does change how it feels to perform it, and in a really positive way, actually. Not to take away from the new pieces at all, but it gives me a little bit of a break from the Bach, and it breaks up the intensity a little bit, because I think when people think, oh my goodness, you know, if I used to play the Bach in it before I had the new variations, I used to play it all the way through with all the repeats, about an hour and 10. And obviously most people think, oh my God, that sounds a bit too much for me. But actually, hopefully people weren't lying. They said that actually they didn't really notice that it was so long because there's so much variety in all the variations. Each variation's broken up. But now I'm going to be doing it very much in 2 parts with the new variations. But yeah, it just gives a little bit of a break from that intensity, which I think if you need with 2 hours of music, certainly.
Absolutely. Michael?
Well, of course, for Bach, the repeats are structural. So it's part of the architecture of the piece. And if you were writing a literal repeat, you have to take account of what the effect is on the architecture as a whole. That was my point. Not that I have anything against other people using repeats if they want to, but presumably they take account of that in the overall shape.
Great. I'm still excited by your idea of writing more variations, Michael, and I'm thinking about other composers contemporary composers that have written big sets of variations. The Frederick Shevsky, People United Will Never Be Defeated, springs to mind. That's a piece where some of the variations are ever so structured, others are improvisational and wandering in every sense and wild in every sense. Do you see this project developing into a Shevsky style opus?
Well, Fred and I have a bit of an ongoing competition to see who can write the biggest piano piece. But no, I think I've done what I've had to do to contribute to that. And Philip Thomas said to me that I'd never really written variations before. So I think I've ticked both those boxes now, and I'm going to move on.
9 is enough. Nicola, do you have any go-to variations?
No, I've never really liked variations as a form for writing in myself. And over the years, I've occasionally written sets and withdrawn them. But I was just going to add a comment on the business of repeats, because none of my music has direct repeats usually. But what I enjoyed in the canon that I wrote for this project was to plan for repeat from the beginning. As Michael says, architecturally you have to. So that, for example, as the first cadence is approached, you hear in augmentation what you're then going to hear, as it were, in diminution when the repeat comes round. So those kind of little turnarounds are great fun to write.
Fantastic. Yes, the idea of cadences, yeah, I personally, as a composer, hesitate with variations, and I would certainly hesitate with this because Bach's cadences are so intricately worked out and so perfectly that I'd be concerned, especially as they're such important structural units in themselves. Alison, variations.
Yeah, my initial thought was being completely terrified and overwhelmed by it. It's not something that I tend to do, but then thinking around it, a lot of how I work with material at a micro level is to do with variation. So it depends how you think around it. And I chose to find variation from within the original, and find my freedom from within, but not necessarily to follow the architectural design perhaps in a strict sense from bar to bar or within a pulse structure. Although, as I say, in the toccata, I'm using all of Bach's notes, and on the score, the original structure is marked in. You don't necessarily hear it in the same way. So I suppose just sort of reimagining the nature of variation a little bit.
Thank you. Julian, I know that you performed the Schumann concerto recently. That's a composer that I associate strongly with variations in a number of senses. Did any of that dribble into your piece?
No, not really. But I've always been at ease with the idea of writing variations, and I think that's because I am very much a tonal composer. And I think one of the nice things about variations is that you can communicate with the audience in a very direct way. If you have a clear structure, and that is likely to mean a clear harmonic structure that you keep returning to, tweaking a bit maybe, but on the whole retaining. If you have that, then your audience can come with you much more easily because they can latch on to something and hear it being revisited. And the way in which you revisit it then becomes the focus of interest. So it's the variety, literally, that you bring to each iteration of the basic structure is what engages the attention. So from that point of view, I've always been a fan of variations, and I like playing sets of variations too. I enjoy that same feeling. The difficulty with variations, I think, is that it can sometimes be really difficult to create a strong sense of narrative. That's if you want to create a strong sense of narrative. So it appears to be the antithesis of sonata-type structures where you've got one set of ideas and a very strongly contrasted set of ideas, and then you see what happens to them. What's the journey? What's the narrative journey? With variations, you don't have that but you have lots of other things, some of which are really quite mysterious to me, so I'm not going to try and identify them. But I do know that for me, variations work very effectively and powerfully as a structure, so I've enjoyed writing these.
Okay, that idea of the programming and taking the listener through on a narrative journey is something I want to ask Rachel about in a moment, because she's made decisions as to where to put these variations in her online performances coming up. But just before then, I want to ask Sam about variations and whether he's got any go-tos. No one's mentioned Beethoven, another big piano variation composer, but have you got any go-tos?
Not particularly. The thing that strikes me first is, I mean, I'm not a pianist, as I said, I'm a clarinetist. And the thing that I often, as a performer, come to that is that very 19th century idea of having a tune, and people have written a lot of these, that of having a tune and then doing virtuosic variations just to show off the instrument. So there are a few of those that I play. So that's my first thought, actually, rather than anything more serious or substantial. And I don't think that didn't really, the variations in that sense didn't really impact on this project for me so much.
Yeah, okay, fair enough.
Can I comment about Beethoven? Because you're right, nobody mentioned Beethoven. What I find fantastic about Beethoven's variations is you go on a journey, a very linear journey, and you, particularly with Diabelli, but it's true also of the 32 C minor, that you end up somewhere in the heavens or something near the end. It's almost at the end of Diabelli, like the kind of thing that happens in the late string quartets. I don't feel that with Goldberg. And indeed, I think my own interest in variations, were I to write a complete set, would be a circular journey, not a linear one. And perhaps one where the theme was revealed at the end, not the beginning. Anyway, that's just a comment on, for me, how different the wonderful Beethoven sets are from Goldberg.
Yeah, absolutely. I find with Goldberg, of course, when the aria comes back at the end, you can't help but feel sort of bittersweet. It feels sad because we've gone to so many places and then you come back and it feels reflective. But of course, what comes just before then with the quadruped is a big joke full of folk tunes and dancing and celebration. So it almost feels at odds with how one receives the end of the piece. But maybe that's just me. Julian.
Yeah, I'd just like to put in a word for Haydn, because he, of course, I don't know whether he single-handedly invented it, but he was certainly the first great master of the double variation sets, where you've got two contrasting themes and you ring the changes on those. And that, of course, immediately creates a kind of sense of vigorous dynamic contrast and narrative, but at the same time gives you the advantages and privileges of the variation form. The F minor variations are just wonderful, but he does it elsewhere as well in some of the piano sonatas.
Absolutely brilliant. I'm putting in a word for Ludoslawski. There's a guy that knows how to do a Passacaglia as well, so steeped in some of these processes, but with a humorous bent always. So, Rachel, coming to the end of our chat, this is a chance perhaps for you to tell us what to expect in terms of the programming of your two sets.
Yeah, well, in terms of going back to the question about what to put where, there were some obvious choices. So Michael's set of three, were based on 19 to 21. So obviously it made complete sense to put them after that. And then Alison's was based on, the toccata was based on 25 and the canon was based on 27. So I put them amongst those ones. And then obviously I wanted to even out how many were in each section. So, and then it just so turned out that Sam's canon was at the second, so it made sense to put it after variation 6. Julian, so it actually worked out rather neatly. Julian's canon is at the 4th, so that came after variation 12. Because there's a talk where I explain about the canons. They're all canon. The first canon's at the first, the second's at the canon at the second. So the parts enter at different intervals. And then Nicola Lefenou's, with it being at the 7th, I put it before the 7th canon, and also she uses the idea of the inverted canon, which Bach doesn't introduce until variation 12. So I didn't want to put it before then. So sorry, that's a bit of a complicated answer. Also with Sam's, interestingly, his first variation is very grand, and it did remind me of the French Overture Variation 16. So I thought, oh, maybe I should put it there. But actually, it's really nice to have it quite early on, because it kind of suddenly wakes us up into a contemporary world, because it's such a very grand opening. So it kind of just happened. Luckily, it all fell into place rather nicely. And it's interesting going back to the structural idea and the development as it goes through the Goldberg. I don't think anyone is saying that each variation is just on its own, because I think he very much thinks of the arc-like structure. You've got the aria at the beginning and the end. And the early variations tend to be quite light, and then it gets more and more intense until you get to 25, which is the very long, slow one. And then the last few variations are really just a bit of fun, I feel. Well, a lot of notes, but very playful. And as you say, the quadrupet's a bit of a joke. So I think he has really thought through the structure of what sets come where. And I just think all these new ones just complement all of that as well. I think what's great as well, we're talking about all the different aspects and different ways you can vary a theme. You can vary the theme itself, you can use the harmonies the same, but treat them in different ways. And although it wasn't in the original brief, I'm just really pleased with how everyone using different aspects to vary has created a really good set of variations. So I think it's going to work really well, hearing different aspects of the Bach through all the different music. And hope you will like it.
I can't wait. So it's Sunday, the 9th of August is part 1.
Yes, that's right.
And that's variations, 1 to 15?
1 to 15 with the sets of set of 3 by Samuel Becker after variation 6 and Julian Broughton after variation 12.
Great. And then part 2 is the 12th.
Wednesday, the 12th of August, that's right, yes. So we have variation 16 to 18 of Bach, Nicola Lefanous's set of 3, 19 to 21 of Michael's by Bach, and then Michael's variations. And then Alison's, I've interspersed them just because it just seemed to work the way with the variations. So after 24, you hear Alison's first variation, then you hear 25, then you hear Alison's toccata, variation 26, Alison's canon, and then 27 to 30 in the aria at the end.
Brilliant. And I mean, it's really cool that Jam on the Marsh is doing an online version of their festival when so many festivals have been, sadly cancelled at this time. Of course, the use of Zoom technology means we can get together from places as diverse as Norfolk and Brighton and everywhere else. So it's wonderful to see everyone here. I want to thank you all very, very much indeed for participating in this chat. It's been really interesting. Can't wait to hear the pieces. And I can't wait to hear more performances of the pieces, which I think you might be lining up for us, Rachel, sometime soon.
Yes, well, I had quite a few performances scheduled. As you might imagine, they're not happening. But the Hurst Festival is also doing a virtual festival in September. And I think everything else has basically been put back a year to 2021. So there will be more performances, but I can't promise when yet.
Well, once again, thank you very much, and see you all on the 9th and the 12th.
Thank you.
Yeah, see you. Thank you, Adam. And